First, how to keep the LED in place for soldering. I use self-closing forceps like this one, and of course do everything with a loop, only not now because of the camera. Place it that way and then I can solder it. Of course I have to mount the forceps to something to stand still. What do I use? I often use small vise. It's quite sturdy on the table, but mostly, and now I also use those alligator clips, and that's then super easy to place the LED perfectly for the loop. Those are with magnets. They do come with a plate, a magnet plate, a metal plate, but I don't really like to solder here because there's always a little bit of an edge for your arm, and your arm has to rest still. Of course, there are also longer ones like those ones. They are quite okay, the black ones, but those ones, which unfortunately are not magnetic, are even better. So I like the magnets of those, but the quality of those silver ones is better on the tips than those of the magnetic black ones. But if you don't have such stuff, maybe you have something like this. Let's remove this. Something like this, which you can clip to your table. I don't like it. I bought it years ago. Don't use it. Or this, even this super cheapo stuff should work. But I use now normally those super heavy metal cubes you can buy, and that's perfect for placing those small, not super heavy clips, and that's the way I solder. And then of course with the loop. Important is you can securely place your arm which holds your soldering iron and your arm which holds your soldering wire and see through the loop. I will show you soldering later of 3 of those LEDs, but with camera it's even more difficult. It is not super difficult that way. Most of those are much better soldered than those ones I will show you on film, because on film I had to solder with hands free more or less because of the camera. Much more difficult. But now let's talk about soldering equipment. Good tweezers come super handy when soldering SMD LEDs. This is not a good tweezer, you see it. This is a good tweezer. This is a good tweezer. Maybe not for SMD LEDs. And those are of course not good tweezers. But for normal RC stuff I use the cheap tweezers, because those good tweezers have a big disadvantage. They are much more expensive of course, but if they fall to the floor they are destroyed, as are the cheap ones. So I highly recommend to buy a pair of really good fine tweezers and use it only for the very special stuff. If you don't know it, you don't know how the difference feels. And that's the same in soldering. If you don't know the difference between a cheap soldering iron and a good soldering iron, or cheap tips, good solder, bad solder, you probably don't know what you miss. What is a good soldering iron? If you are newer to the hobby, probably most of you will have the new TS100, TS80 or similar super popular soldering irons, which are promoted on YouTube. I don't know how many videos there are, and everybody thinks that's the perfect soldering iron. It is of course not. The only advantage of those soldering irons is they are cheap. They are okay, but for sure not perfect for soldering SMD LEDs. If you're only soldering XT60, XT30 plugs and some wires, then you are fine. Guys, did you ever think how often you want to solder in the field, or you will solder in the field? Because that's always advertised. You can solder in the field. When will you solder in the field? I did solder in the field about 10 years ago in my wild micro heli days, when the helis crashed regularly and sometimes the wires, the battery wires, came off the board. And therefore I had, and I still have, and it still works, this €5 or $5, I don't know, super cheapo battery soldering iron from Hobby King. And for doing this 1 or 2, maybe 3 times in my life I did it, soldering spots, no good spots, this was okay. But soldering in the field is no argument, and soldering with the LiPo is no argument either, because did you ever think of maybe touching the LiPo with the soldering iron? And having all the electronics in the handle and those long new tips, that's not super good for soldering super delicate stuff. That's a good soldering iron and handle. Check this out. You have to solder super tiny stuff. Most important, super flexible wire, super light, well balanced. Check a normal common soldering iron. That's also ERSA, same brand, German, top brand. But with such a big iron, it's nearly impossible to really do this super delicate stuff. And with this, it's awesome. There's a further argument for the new soldering tips, the long ones with the heat element inside. They heat up faster. Guys, did you ever think how often, what argument is this? Do you solder 30, 40, 50 times a day? They should heat up in 5 seconds. I show you something. That's my beloved ERSA Icon Pico. I love my soldering station. Only disadvantage, the on-off switch is on the back side. It's cold now, and let's count. I have 340. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. Go back. So it needed 18 seconds. If those super fast soldering irons heat up in 5 seconds, you will gain 13 seconds. And how often do you solder? That's not of any importance, at least not for me, and I guess not for you either. So the only advantage, or the only plus point for those TS100, TS80, they are cheap and they solder well, and you are good if you solder your XT60 plugs, XT30 for sure. I don't like at all. They are powered by LiPo, but you also can power them, of course, by a power supply. But for soldering SMD LEDs, I highly recommend to buy a soldering station with a super light and super well balanced handle. And my ERSA Icon Pico, it's perfect. Love it. Soldering tips. Super tiny SMD LEDs, so you think you would need super fine pointed soldering tips? No, don't use them. I don't know why I bought those. When I bought my soldering iron, I have 2 or 3 of those. Nearly never use those super fine tips for nothing. I don't know for what they are really good. I sometimes only use them to clean up the legs of transistors if it's not possible with soldering wick, but super small spot of heat transfer, not good at all. Normally you will get those pencil pointed soldering tips. Do I have a new one here somewhere? This one. Yeah, they are okay, but they are not by far not my favorite tips. I solder nearly everything I do with chisels. You see, that's the tip, the same as this one. 1.8 millimeter chisel, and that's perfect for this. And I even could do it with this, it's 2 point something, and then you, maybe that's too large, 3 millimeter or 5 millimeter chisel. But highly recommend to buy those chisel type soldering tips. They are by far best for nearly everything, and even for the super tiny SMD LEDs. Those are super helpful too if you are soldering on boards, those angled ones. For example, if you're stacking MOSFETs on a mini C board or on a helicopter board. But that's okay here, pointed. But for the tiny SMD LEDs, don't use those. If you have a chisel, use the chisel, even this large chisel. It will be much easier. And of course, the quality of soldering tips is also, wow. A long time ago, I bought for a cheap soldering iron, cheap tips from China, and you cannot use them. Good quality soldering tips are such a big difference. It's unbelievable, but of course they are not super cheap. This as a tip, I get you get a cheap soldering station on Amazon for this. What's also super important, clean your tips. Clean your tips before and during soldering. So take your soldering iron, put solder on it, clean it, and then do the soldering, and clean it again, put solder on it, and then solder. I use this metal spong for cleaning, but you can also use those spongs which you have to make wet. You have to put water on them. They are as good, I guess. I don't know which ones are better. Both should be fine, but I simply prefer the metal one because it's here on the right side and I don't have to put water on it. And if I want to solder, switch on my soldering station and solder, and can use this without making a spong wet. I'm not a professional in soldering at all, but I couldn't find any differences. Searching what's better, a wet spong or a metal spong, and both seem to be fine. So heat up your soldering iron, tin it, clean it, solder, clean it, tin it, clean it, solder with solder. And this cleaning is super important because it highly improves the heat transfer. So clean it, clean it, clean it, clean it. And now let's talk about solder.